The scent of cinnamon and cloves had always been the herald of something good in my life. For 43 years, that combination of spices meant my wife Margaret was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her laughter floating through our modest home like music. It meant our daughter Sarah would come running down the stairs, her pigtails flying, demanding to taste the filling before it went into the pie crust. It meant the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy, the kind of love that made every struggle worthwhile. But on this particular November afternoon, as I parked my 15-year-old pickup truck in front of my daughter's sprawling suburban mansion, the aroma of roasted herbs and baked goods drifting from her open windows brought me no comfort. Instead, it wrapped around my throat like a cold hand, squeezing the air from my lungs. I knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived 68 years of life's harsh lessons, that I was about to walk into a battlefield. He just couldn't predict which enemy would fire the first shot. There's something profoundly disorienting about feeling like a stranger in your own child's life. You spend decades building a foundation for them, pouring every ounce of your strength into creating a stable ground for their feet. You teach them that kindness matters more than currency, that character outlasts possessions, that the measure of a person isn't found in their bank account but in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. You hope these lessons take root, that they become the invisible architecture of their adult lives. But sometimes, the world gets in the way. Sometimes, the people your children marry have different blueprints, ones that don't include the values you held sacred. Sometimes, the fortress you built gets demolished brick by brick, replaced by something unrecognizable, something that makes you feel like a relic from a forgotten era. That was precisely how I felt sitting in my truck, staring at the imposing double doors of my daughter's house. He was a ghost from her past, an embarrassment she had to tolerate out of obligation rather than love. He ran my hand over my only decent sweater, the navy blue one Margaret had bought me for our 25th anniversary. It was starting to peel at the elbows, and there was a small stain on the cuff that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase, but it was clean. I'd washed it by hand the night before, careful not to twist the fibers. He didn't want to give anyone ammunition, not that it would have mattered because some people have already written your entire story before you even open your mouth. They've decided who you are based on the thickness of your wallet, the age of your vehicle, the calluses on your hands, and nothing you do, no amount of politeness or humility, will ever change the narrative they've constructed in their minds. The door swung open before I could knock, and there stood my daughter Sarah. She was beautiful, just like her mother, with the same honey-colored hair and the same warm eyes, but something had shifted in her expression over the years. There was a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before, a wariness that made her look like she was constantly bracing for impact. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give to a distant relative you barely remember, polite but hollow. "Dad," she said, her voice pitched a little too high, "you made it. Come in, come in." He stepped across the threshold, and the familiar smells of Thanksgiving were immediately overwhelmed by something else, lavender maybe, or some expensive candle that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The house was immaculate, the kind of clean that felt more like a museum than a home, with cream-colored carpets, gleaming hardwood floors, abstract paintings on the walls that I couldn't begin to interpret. It was a world away from my small apartment with its worn-out recliner and the collection of Western novels I'd been slowly working through for the past 3 years. I felt like I'd wandered onto a movie set where I didn't belong. Every surface looked too pristine to touch, too expensive to risk damaging, and I stood frozen in the entryway clutching a bottle of red wine I'd bought on sale at the grocery store. It suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate compared to the crystal decanters I could see on the sideboard in the dining room. "Let me take your coat," Sarah said, but her hands remained at her sides. She was waiting, watching me fumble with the zipper like I was some kind of slow child. I finally managed to wrestle it off, and I saw her eyes flick to the worn patches on the elbows, a macro expression of something, disgust, embarrassment, pity, crossing her features before she smoothed it away. She took the coat and hung it in the hall closet, careful to position it so it wouldn't touch her husband's expensive wool overcoat. As she did, a voice sliced through the silence from the living room, a brittle, cultivated voice, the kind that had been polished by years of private schooling and exclusive country clubs. "Sarah, darling, is that your father?" Finally. He was beginning to think he'd gotten lost on his way from, well, wherever it is he lives now. My stomach dropped because my daughter's mother-in-law, a woman named Beatrice who had never made any secret of her disdain for me, was seated in the living room like a queen holding court. She was a handsome woman, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly pension check, with a string of pearls around her neck and diamonds sparkling on her fingers. She didn't rise to greet me, she simply looked me up and down with the cold assessment of a predator sizing up wounded prey. He forced a smile onto my face, the same smile I'd used for decades to smooth over difficult situations at work. "Good afternoon, Beatrice. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you for having me." "Oh, we didn't have much choice, did we?" she said, taking a delicate sip from a crystal glass. Sarah insisted. "Something about family obligations, or some such nonsense." We were perfectly content to have our own intimate celebration, but she felt compelled to, well, include you. My son-in-law, Robert, emerged from the study, wiping his hands on a monogrammed handkerchief. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man with the easy confidence that came from old money and a successful career in finance. In the early years of Sarah's marriage, I'd been genuinely happy for her. I thought Robert was a good match, steady and successful, but over time I'd noticed the subtle shifts, the way he'd correct her in front of company, the way he'd dismiss her opinions with a patronizing pat on the head, the way he'd roll his eyes whenever she mentioned her working-class upbringing. It was a man who saw the world in terms of winners and losers, and he'd made it clear which category my family fell into. "Robert," I said, extending my hand. "Good to see you." He took my hand briefly, his grip firm but impersonal. "Frank. Glad you could make it." The words were polite, but the tone suggested he'd rather be doing anything else. I looked around the room, hoping to spot a friendly face, searching for my grandson Henry. He was the only bright spot in this cold, gilded cage, and he had his grandmother's eyes, my Margaret's eyes, warm and curious and full of mischief, but he wasn't there. It was probably in his room, or playing in the backyard, anywhere but in this room full of stiff adults and stiffer conversation. Sarah guided me into the living room, her hand hovering awkwardly near my back, as if she was afraid to actually touch me. "Dad, why don't you have a seat? Dinner will be ready soon." He chose a spot on a leather ottoman, far from the pristine white couch, because I didn't want to risk leaving a mark. Beatrice watched me sit, her eyes cataloging every detail, my worn shoes, the slight fraying at the cuffs of my pants, the cheap watch on my wrist. "You know, Frank," Beatrice said, using my first name like it was a mild inconvenience, "Robert's father, God rest his soul, always used to say that if you can't dress appropriately for an occasion, you shouldn't attend." It was a man who understood the importance of appearances. He felt the heat rising to my cheeks, but I refused to take the bait because I'd been dealing with people like Beatrice my whole life, people who thought they were better because they'd been born into different circumstances. "I'm a retired pipe fitter, Beatrice," I said quietly. "We don't exactly wear suits on the job." He thought I cleaned up all right for a family dinner. "Bless your heart," she said, the words dripping with condescension. "You certainly tried." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything, but she was across the room rearranging flowers in a vase with intense concentration, pretending she hadn't heard. Robert was on his phone scrolling through emails with the air of a man who had more important things to attend to, and they had both checked out the moment the first barb was thrown, which told me this was a well-rehearsed routine. The conversation that followed was a blur of luxury and exclusion. They talked about their upcoming trip to Tuscany, the new Mercedes Robert was leasing, the elite private school Henry was attending, and I sat silently feeling smaller with each passing moment, an artifact from a different life, an uncomfortable reminder that not everyone in the family had been born with a silver spoon. Sarah eventually announced that dinner was ready. Everything is set, let's move to the dining room, and I breathed a small sigh of relief because at least we'd be doing something, eating, moving, anything to break the suffocating stillness of the living room. He followed the others, shuffling behind their expensive shoes and the swirl of their designer perfumes. The dining room was spectacular, a massive oak table draped in a lace tablecloth, gleaming silverware arranged with precision, a centerpiece of fresh flowers and candles that must have cost a fortune, and there at the far end was Henry, my grandson, my little man. He was wearing a miniature suit and tie, looking uncomfortable and out of place, but when he saw me his whole face transformed, lighting up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Grandpa," he shouted, waving frantically. "You're here." My heart swelled with warmth because for the first time all day I let a genuine smile break through. "Hey there, Woody," I said. "Hope's my favorite guy." Beatrice immediately shushed him. "Henry," indoor voice, "and sit up straight. You look like a slouch." The seating arrangement was clearly designed to minimize contact with me. Sarah was at the head of the table, Robert at the foot, Beatrice on one side, and Robert's brother, a pompous man named Jeffrey with a Rolex and a permanent smirk, on the other. There were several empty seats, and then to my dismay I was directed to the very end of the table, as far from everyone as possible. "You won't mind, will you, Frank?" Sarah said with a thin smile. "We like to keep the central seats for the immediate family." Immediate family. I was the father who had worked double shifts to put her through college, and I wasn't considered immediate family. He nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of rejection. "Of course. It's a beautiful table. I'm happy to be anywhere." He took my seat, and Henry immediately scrambled to sit next to me, which made Beatrice visibly recoil. "Henry, darling, come sit by Nana," she cooed. "You don't want to sit all the way down there, do you?" "No, I want to sit by Grandpa," Henry said stubbornly. "Henry," Sarah said using the warning tone she usually reserved for serious infractions, "don't be difficult. Come sit with the adults." "But I want to hear Grandpa's stories," Henry protested. "He used to build pipelines and bridges. He has the best stories." Beatrice snorted. "He was a pipe fitter, darling. There's a difference between building something and simply, well, fitting pipes together. He wasn't an engineer." The comment stung more than I wanted to admit because it was true. I didn't have a degree, I didn't have the fancy credentials Robert and his family could boast about, but I was damn good at what I did. I could look at a blueprint and see a complex system come to life. I knew how to install piping that could withstand extreme pressure and temperature. I knew how to keep men safe on dangerous job sites. And it wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. I'd earned every callus on my hands. We began to eat, and the food was excellent, of course: roasted turkey, honey-glazed ham, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, sweet potato pie. It was a feast, but I could barely taste it because the atmosphere was so cold and hostile that I found myself just pushing food around my plate, trying to survive the ordeal. Beatrice was in her element, holding court like a duchess at a royal banquet, talking about her charity work, the country club's new renovations, the difficulty of finding reliable domestic staff. And every word was a subtle jab at my station in life, a reminder that I was a worker while she was a woman of leisure. "You know," she said, turning to me with a predatory smile, "I'm surprised you managed to get a seat at the table at all. We usually have the hired help eat in the kitchen." She laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound devoid of any real humor. "I'm only joking, of course. But that is a nice sweater. Where did you get it?" "A thrift store," I said quietly, and the table went silent. Everyone looked at me waiting for my reaction, and my hands started to shake beneath the table. I had to clasp them together to steady them. Robert finally spoke. "Beatrice, please. Let's just enjoy the meal." But she wasn't finished. She was like a shark that had smelled blood in the water. "I'm just making conversation, Robert. I'm curious. Tell us, Frank, what's it like being, well, working class? It must be so freeing. No one expects anything from you. No one depends on you. You can just, well, exist." I felt the weight of everyone's gaze. Sarah was studying her napkin with a faint flush on her cheeks. Jeffrey was smirking openly. Even Robert couldn't meet my eyes, focused on carving his turkey with surgical precision. I took a deep breath and said, "I wouldn't say it's freeing, Beatrice. It's a struggle, sure. But I'm proud of what I built. He supported my family. He put my daughter through college. He paid off my house." "Oh, you had a house," she said, raising her eyebrows in mock surprise. "He assumed you lived in a, well, I don't know, a mobile home or something." She laughed again. "A house. How quaint." My blood was boiling, and it wasn't even the insults directed at me that hurt the most. It was the shame I saw in Sarah's eyes, the way she sat there silent, letting this woman tear down her father in her own home. But I held it together because I told myself it was just a few hours. I could endure a few hours for Henry. I could endure it for the chance to spend Thanksgiving with my grandson. He turned to Henry, trying to escape the nightmare. "So, Woody, what do you think of the turkey?" He leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I like the pie better. Can I have pie for dinner?" I laughed, the first real laugh I'd managed all day. "You know, when I was a kid, I tried that once. My mom told me if I ate pie for dinner, I'd turn into a pumpkin." He says went wild. "Really?" "I'm kidding, Woody. But let's save some room for the good stuff, okay?" He nodded enthusiastically, and for a moment the tension in my chest eased. Then Henry started fidgeting in his seat, pulling at his tie, trying to loosen the knot. "Mom," he whined, "my tie is too tight. Grandpa, can you help me? You used to wear a tie for work, right?" Sarah looked up sharply. "Henry, stop bothering your grandfather and don't loosen your tie. You look very handsome like that." "But it's hurting," he whined. "It's choking me." He started coughing and gasping in an exaggerated performance, and Beatrice glared at me as if I had somehow orchestrated the entire scene. "Can't you control your grandson?" she hissed. "We're trying to have a civilized meal." I looked at Sarah, but she was staring at her plate, jaw clenched. "He can fix his tie, Sarah," I said. "It's no trouble." "Dad, just leave it," she mumbled, not looking up. "Es fine. Ella help him," I said, standing up. "Ebe got it." I walked around to Henry's chair and knelt beside him, gently working the knot to loosen it just enough to take the pressure off his neck. "There you go, Woody," I whispered. "Is that better?" "Thanks, Grandpa," he said, beaming. He started to walk back to my seat, but as I passed the main table near where Beatrice was sitting, she cleared her throat loudly. "Oh, and Frank," she said. "Since you're up, why don't you clear the plates? You must be accustomed to work, after all." It was the last straw, such an unnecessary cruel comment designed to publicly humiliate me, to establish me as a servant in their home, and I stopped and turned to face her. "I'm not going to clear the plates," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm a guest in this house. My daughter invited me. I'm going to sit down and finish my meal." The room went dead silent, and Beatrice's face flushed a deep ugly red because she wasn't accustomed to being challenged. "Oh, you want to sit?" She spat, her eyes narrowing. "Do you want to play guest?" She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and before I could react, before anyone could stop her, she advanced on me. I thought she was going to say something, but instead she drew back her hand and slapped me across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side, I tasted blood in my mouth, and the pain was sharp, immediate, and humiliating. I clutched my cheek, staring at the floor in shock. "That is for being an ungrateful, crude old man," she hissed, looming over me. "This is my son's house, and you come in here with your poor people's manners. Poor people belong outside, not at my table. You're nothing but a clumsy oaf, and I'm sick of pretending you're welcome here." I looked up at my daughter, my vision swimming. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "are you going to let her do this?" Sarah's face was pale. She was gripping the table so hard her knuckles were white, and for a split second I saw a flicker of the old Sarah, the girl who would have jumped in front of a moving car to protect me, but then it was gone. She looked at her mother-in-law, then at Robert, who was shaking his head imperceptibly, and she hesitated. She opened her mouth to speak and I waited because I needed her. "That," she said finally, her voice weak and pathetic, just apologize, please. Just apologize to her and we can sit down and finish dinner." My heart shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't the slap that broke me, it was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, watching her father get physically assaulted in her own dining room and telling him to apologize. "Apologize," I said, my voice cracking. "She hit me, Sarah. She slapped me across the face." "I know," she said, looking down at the floor. "But you provoked her, Dad. You were being disrespectful. Just say you're sorry and we can move on." I couldn't believe my ears. I looked at the others. Robert was staring at his napkin with a look of utter indifference on his face. Jeffrey was smirking and leaning back in his chair, clearly enjoying the drama. And Beatrice stood there with arms crossed and a triumphant glint in her eye. "Well," she snapped, "are you going to say you're sorry? Or do I have to call the police and have you removed from the premises for trespassing?" I stood there, my world crumbling around me. I had nowhere to go. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't physically confront a woman. I couldn't say the things I wanted to say in front of Henry. I was trapped. And I opened my mouth to speak, to somehow salvage the situation, to try to explain that I just wanted to spend Thanksgiving with my grandson. But I didn't get the chance to finish because a small clear voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mom." It was Henry. He had left his seat and was standing near me, and in his small hand he held his phone, his face illuminated by the screen. He had been quiet the entire time, a silent witness to the ugly scene unfolding in front of him, but now he wasn't looking at us, he was looking at his phone. "Mom," he said again, his voice wavering a little. "Grandma." Sarah looked up, startled. "Henry, honey, go back to your seat. This is adult business." "But Mom," he said, his voice rising. "Something happened." "Henry," We'll talk about it later, Sarah said, reaching for him. No, ma'am, he shouted, and the room fell silent again. His voice was shaking and his eyes were wide with panic. Listen, I recorded a video of Thanksgiving. He held up his phone, and we could all see the screen. It was a live video, a Facebook live video, and the blood drained from my face, the color drained from Sarah's face. Beatrice's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of pure unadulterated horror. What are you talking about, Henry? Sarah demanded, her voice rising hysterically. Turn that off. But Henry ignored her. He looked at me, his hero, his grandfather who had just been humiliated in the most brutal way possible, and then he looked at the camera. His voice, though trembling, was steady. Grandma, he said into the phone, his eyes filled with tears. You're alive. You're on the internet. Everyone can see you. A collective gasp went around the room. Beatrice lunged for the phone. Give me that, you little brat, she screamed, but Henry was quick. He ran to me, hiding behind my legs. Beatrice stopped her pursuit, her face twisted in a mask of rage and panic, because she knew that everything she had just done, every insult, every sneer, and every slap was now streaming live to God knows who. The camera was facing the ceiling, but the audio was still clear. There was a moment of static silence, and then the phone screen changed. It was no longer a live video. It had ended, but the damage was done. Henry had recorded the entire confrontation. He had recorded his grandmother hitting me, yelling at me, calling me poor. He had recorded his own mother doing nothing to stop it. He had recorded his father telling me to apologize for being assaulted. The room was frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the seconds of their public destruction. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with a rage she had never directed at her own mother. Henry, you didn't. Who did you send that to? Henry looked up at me, his eyes wide, then back at his mother, and he took a deep, shuddering breath before asking the question that would echo in the silence of that cursed room. Ma'am, isn't it wrong to hit people? He asked it with a simplicity that was heartbreaking, and he looked at his grandmother, then at his mother, then at his father. The question hung in the air, a perfect indictment of the adults in the room. Isn't it wrong to hit people? He repeated, his voice cracking. Grandma just hit Grandpa. He saw her, and nobody did anything. It was right. They had all failed the most basic test of decency. They had stood by and let a monster bully a harmless old man, and they had been caught red-handed, not by a security camera, but by a child who knew better than all of them. Robert finally looked up. The mask of pathetic compliance was gone, and in its place was a look of dawning horror, because he understood the implications. This wasn't just a family squabble, this was a PR nightmare. This was the end of his charmed life. Oh my God, Dad, he whispered, looking at me with tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Sarah looked like she was about to be sick. Beatrice had her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. But I didn't care about their panic, I didn't care about their tears. All that mattered was Henry. He knelt down beside my grandson and put my hands on his shoulders. Henry, Woody, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Can I see the phone? He handed it to me, his little fingers cold against mine, and I looked at the screen. The friends list on the broadcast was a sea of familiar names. I saw Sarah's boss, the head of the PTA, the neighbors, and dozens of other people, but it wasn't just Facebook. As I scrolled through the notifications on the phone, I saw the video had been automatically uploaded to YouTube, shared on Twitter, and sent through a dozen WhatsApp groups. It had been viewed over 1,000 times already. 1,000 people had just watched me get slapped and humiliated by a woman who thought she was untouchable, and they had also watched my daughter, my own daughter, fail to stand up for me. I looked at Sarah. She was crying now, pathetic sobs shaking her frame. Dad, please, we can fix this. We can delete it. We can say it was a joke. Please, don't let this ruin us. I stood up feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. I looked at the phone one last time and I realized something. I realized that the video, the proof of their ugliness, wasn't meant to ruin them, it was meant to save me. It was the justice I hadn't even known I was owed. The revenge wasn't something I had planned, it wasn't a calculated scheme to destroy them, it was a gift from the most innocent person in the room. A 9-year-old boy wise beyond his years who couldn't bear to see the man he loved get treated like garbage. He looked at Beatrice, who was now trembling, her bravado completely shattered. You told me that poor people belonged outside, I said, my voice low and steady. You were right. He do not belong here. He never did. But you know what? Watching your reputation crumble from the outside is going to be the most beautiful view in the world. He handed the phone back to Henry. Woody, I said, this is the best Thanksgiving present I could ever have asked for. You have a good heart. You are the only person in this family who deserves a seat at the table. I turned to leave, but Sarah reached out and grabbed my arm. Dad, please, don't go. We can talk about this. He can make this right. Make it right, I said, pulling my arm away from her. You let her hit me, Sarah. You told me to apologize to her. You were my daughter and you treated me like I was nothing. There is no making this right. You made your choice tonight, you chose the status quo, you chose comfort over your own father. He looked at Robert. And you, I welcomed you into my family, and you treated me like a disease. He will never forget this, and the world won't either. You wanted to be the king of your little kingdom, now you're just the laughingstock of the internet. He walked out of the dining room, through the sterile living room, and to the front door. I put on my worn-out sweater, the one I had been so ashamed of just a few hours earlier. And now it felt like a badge of honor because it reminded me of who I was, it reminded me that I had survived the worst night of my life and I had come out on top. As I walked down the gravel path, away from the house, the sound of angry shouting and panicked crying erupted from inside. The perfect Thanksgiving dinner was over, the facade had crumbled. In the coming days, the video went viral. A wealthy socialite slapping her son-in-law's elderly father was exactly the kind of clickbait the internet craved, and it was picked up by local news, then national news. Beatrice was forced to resign from her charity positions. Sarah lost her job when her boss, who had seen the video, realized she had the moral compass of a rattlesnake. The company didn't want to be associated with such an ugly display of elitism, and the public had chosen a side. They had chosen me. Robert called me 100 times, begging for my forgiveness, begging for me to make a statement saying it was all a misunderstanding. He was worried about his business, his reputation, his house, but he didn't apologize for his actions. He apologized because he got caught. He never answered his calls, I never returned his texts, because I knew that if I spoke to him the pain would come flooding back, but I also knew that a man doesn't have to accept an apology that isn't real. He doesn't have to forgive a daughter who watched him fall and walked away. Months later, I got a letter. It was from Henry, and in it he included a drawing of the two of us sitting on a park bench eating ice cream. He said he missed me, he said he was sorry for what happened, he said he was grounded from his phone for a year but he didn't care, he said he would do it again in a heartbeat. He was the only one who understood what had happened that night. The slap didn't hurt as much as the silence, but in the end it wasn't the slap that defined me, it was the voice of my grandson, the innocent standing up to cruelty, that healed me. It gave me back my dignity, and sometimes that's all a father can ask for. Sometimes the only justice you need is the truth shared by the smallest voice in the room. The weeks that followed that fateful Thanksgiving dinner were strange and disorienting. I had returned to my small apartment, the familiar comfort of my worn-out recliner, the stack of Western novels on my nightstand, and the quiet that had become my constant companion since Margaret passed. But the quiet felt different now. It wasn't the lonely silence of grief anymore, it was the peaceful stillness of a man who had finally been set free. He didn't have to dread the next holiday, didn't have to brace myself for the next round of humiliation, didn't have to pretend I was grateful for scraps of affection thrown my way out of obligation. The video had done what I could never have done myself, it had exposed the truth for everyone to see. The first few days after the video went viral were chaos. My phone rang constantly, unknown numbers flashing on the screen, reporters and journalists hungry for a statement, for confirmation, for anything they could use to keep the story alive. I let every call go to voicemail because I wasn't interested in being a spectacle, wasn't interested in feeding the media frenzy that was consuming my daughter's family. He had spent my whole life working quietly and living honestly, and I wasn't about to start performing for an audience now. But the world had other plans because the story spread like wildfire, appearing on morning talk shows, evening news segments, and countless social media posts. Beatrice became a symbol of everything wrong with inherited wealth and unearned superiority, her face plastered across screens with captions that ranged from scathing to savage. Sarah and Robert were painted as complicit cowards, people who had sacrificed their integrity for social standing and material comfort. The internet had chosen its villains, and it showed no mercy. I received letters too, hundreds of them, from strangers across the country who had seen the video and felt compelled to reach out. Some were from elderly parents who recognized their own struggles in my story, people who had been marginalized and dismissed by their children's spouses. Others were from adult children who had watched their own parents suffer similar indignities and regretted their silence. Many were from young people, like Henry, who were horrified by what they had witnessed and wanted to express their support. I read every letter, every email, every message, and each one reminded me that I wasn't alone, that the cruelty I had endured was part of a larger pattern, and that speaking up, even indirectly, had given voice to countless others who had suffered in silence. He kept a box of the most meaningful letters under my bed, a small treasure of human connection that I would turn to whenever the weight of what had happened pressed down on me. Sarah's attempts to reach me were relentless at first. She called dozens of times, left voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas to angry accusations. She blamed the wine, blamed the stress of the holidays, blamed Beatrice's influence, blamed everything except herself. He listened to each message, and with everyone I felt the distance between us grow because it wasn't that I didn't love her anymore, I would always love her, she was my daughter, my only child, the little girl who used to hold my hand and ask me endless questions about the world. But love alone wasn't enough, not when it was so deeply entangled with pain and betrayal. I needed time to heal, time to process, time to figure out who I was outside the shadow of her rejection, and I needed her to understand that an apology meant nothing if it wasn't accompanied by genuine change. Robert's attempts were different, more calculated and more strategic. He didn't call to apologize, he called to negotiate because he wanted me to make a public statement, to say that the video had been taken out of context, that Beatrice had been provoked, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He offered money, a significant amount of money, to help me with my living expenses, to set me up in a nicer apartment, to give me a comfortable retirement. It was an insult dressed up as generosity, a bribe wrapped in the guise of concern. He didn't want to make things right, he wanted to make things quiet, and I didn't respond to his messages because some things couldn't be bought, and my dignity was one of them. Beatrice's fall from grace was swift and brutal. The charity she had chaired for years asked for her resignation within days of the video's release. The country club where she had reigned as queen bee quietly revoked her membership, citing a violation of their code of conduct. Her social circle evaporated overnight, friends who had been loyal for decades suddenly finding reasons to be unavailable, events she had been eagerly anticipating suddenly being cancelled or rescheduled without her. She became a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who thought wealth and status could protect them from the consequences of cruelty. Sarah's professional life crumbled alongside her personal one because the company where she had worked as a senior marketing executive fired her within a week. Her boss explained that they couldn't afford the negative publicity, couldn't be associated with someone who had stood by while her father was assaulted. Sarah tried to fight it, threatened to sue, claimed she was being unfairly targeted, but the evidence was clear and it was everywhere because the video was an unblinking record of her failure, her silence, her willingness to sacrifice her father for her comfort. Robert's business suffered as well, though not as catastrophically. His reputation was tarnished, his invitations to exclusive events dried up, his network of influential contacts grew cold and distant. He lost more than he could calculate, not just money, but respect, trust, and the easy confidence that came from being part of the club. Henry was the only one I genuinely worried about because he had been thrown into the middle of something he shouldn't have witnessed, and the weight of what he had done, exposing his family's secrets to the world, was heavy for a 9-year-old. He reached out to him, sending letters and small gifts, letting him know I was proud of him, that I loved him, that none of what had happened was his fault. He wrote back, his handwriting still clumsy and childlike, telling me about school, about his friends, about how much he missed me. He told me that his parents had taken away his phone and limited his internet access, that they were angry about the video, that they had told him he had made a terrible mistake. But he told me he didn't regret it, didn't regret standing up for me, didn't regret telling the truth, and he said it was the bravest thing he had ever done and that he would do it again if he had to. Reading those words, I cried for the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, cried for the innocence that had been shattered, but I also felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost hurt because he was better than his parents, better than his grandmother, better than all of them combined. He had a goodness in him that couldn't be corrupted, a moral compass that pointed true north, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure he knew how special he was. Months passed, and the frenzy began to fade. New scandals emerged, new videos went viral, and the internet moved on to its next target. But the damage to my relationship with Sarah and Robert was permanent because I had stopped waiting for a genuine apology, stopped hoping for a reconciliation, stopped expecting them to change. He had accepted that the people they had become were different from the people I had raised and welcomed into my life, and I had released myself from the burden of trying to fix them. He focused on my own life instead, small things mostly, reading my books, taking walks in the park, volunteering at a local community center where I helped teach basic skills to young men and women who were struggling to find their way. He found purpose in those small acts of kindness, a sense of meaning that had been missing since Margaret died, and I was building a new life, one brick at a time. The community center became my second home because the kids there were hungry for attention, for guidance, for someone who believed in them. Many of them came from broken homes, had been failed by the system, had been told their whole lives that they weren't good enough, and I saw myself in them. I taught them the skills I had learned over decades of honest work, how to read a blueprint, how to measure and cut and fit, how to work safely and efficiently. But more than that, I taught them the things that really matter, how to treat people with respect, how to stand up for what was right even when it was hard, how to hold on to their dignity even when the world tried to take it away. They responded to me in ways I hadn't expected, calling me Grandpa Frank, asking me for advice, seeking my approval, and they filled a space in my heart that had been empty for too long. I visited Henry whenever I could, driving to the park near his school, meeting him after classes, spending precious hours together. We would sit on a bench and eat ice cream, just like in the drawing he had sent me, and talk about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams, about the places he wanted to see, the things he wanted to do, the kind of person he wanted to become. He told me he wanted to be like me, honest and kind and brave, and I told him he already was, that he had been brave on the worst night of my life, and that I would never forget it. We made plans for the future, trips we would take together, projects we would work on, adventures we would share, and I knew his parents didn't approve of our relationship, but I didn't care because Henry needed me, and I needed him. Sarah eventually stopped calling, and the silence was a relief at first, but then it became something else, a quiet ache that I carried with me every day. He missed her, missed the little girl she had been, missed the bond we had shared before the world had gotten in the way. But I knew that the woman she had become was a stranger to me, and that trying to force a relationship with that stranger would only cause more pain. He wrote her a letter finally, a long letter that took me weeks to compose, telling her I loved her, that I had always loved her, that I would always love her. I told her I didn't hate her, didn't blame her, didn't hold her responsible for everything that had happened, but I told her that I needed her to understand that love without action was hollow, that respect without effort was empty, that being a family meant showing up for each other when it was hard, not just when it was easy. I told her that I was proud of her, and I believed she could be better, and I was waiting for her to choose that path, and that the door was always open, but she had to walk through it because I couldn't carry her anymore. She wrote back a few weeks later, and her letter was different from the one she had sent before because it wasn't full of excuses or accusations, wasn't a plea for help or a demand for forgiveness. It was honest, raw, and painful to read. She told me she had been ashamed of her past, ashamed of where she came from, ashamed of me, and she told me she had let Beatrice's influence, Robert's expectations, and the pressure of her new life turn her into someone she didn't recognize. She told me she had failed me, failed herself, failed her son, and that she was sorry in a way that went beyond words. She told me she was in therapy, working through her issues, trying to understand why she had been so willing to sacrifice her integrity for acceptance, and she told me she understood if I couldn't forgive her, if I needed more time, if I needed her to prove herself through action rather than words. It was the first time she had taken full responsibility for what had happened, and even though the wounds were still fresh, I felt a flicker of hope. He didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to be sure. I needed to see if her change was real, if it would last, if she was genuinely committed to becoming a better person. I watched from a distance, through the updates I received from Henry, through the occasional letters she sent, through the small acts of kindness she performed that were reported back to me. She started volunteering at a local shelter, started speaking out about the importance of humility and integrity, started reaching out to other estranged families in her social circle. She was trying, really trying, and I could see it, but I also knew that trust was fragile and that rebuilding it would take time. I was willing to give her that time, willing to let her prove herself, willing to believe that people could change, but I was also wary because I had been hurt before and I wasn't eager to repeat that experience. Robert never reached out again after the initial flurry of calls and messages. He had moved on to a new life, a new reputation, a new way of being in the world that didn't require him to confront what he had done. I didn't expect anything different from him, didn't hope for anything more, didn't waste my energy on resentment because some people were incapable of change, incapable of self-reflection, incapable of the kind of growth that required them to admit they were wrong. Robert was one of those people, and I had made peace with that. Beatrice faded from the public eye entirely, her reputation ruined, her social connection severed, her sense of superiority demolished. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to a small town in another state, trying to escape the stigma, trying to start over, But I didn't know if she had learned anything from the experience, and I doubted it because people like her rarely did. Henry continued to be the brightest light in my life. He turned 10, then 11, and with each year he grew more thoughtful, more compassionate, more determined to make the world a better place. He started a club at his school that focused on combating bullying, standing up for marginalized students, and promoting kindness. He wrote letters to local politicians advocating for better support for elderly people, drawing on his own experience of seeing his grandfather mistreated, and he talked to me about his plans, his dreams, his vision for the future. And I listened with a full heart because he was going to do great things, and I was honored to be part of his journey. On one crisp autumn afternoon, I received a letter from Henry that changed everything. It was an invitation to a community event he was organizing, a dinner for families who had been affected by estrangement and division, and he wanted me to be the guest of honor. He wanted me to speak, to share my story, to inspire others who were struggling to find the strength to heal, and he told me that his mother would be there, that she had volunteered to help with the event, that she was trying to make amends. He told me that he understood if I wasn't ready, if I couldn't face her yet, if I needed more time, but he also told me that he believed in second chances, that he believed people could change, that he believed in the power of forgiveness. And I read his letter over and over, tears streaming down my face, and I knew that I couldn't say no. The night of the event arrived, and I stood in the back of the room watching the crowd. There were families everywhere, parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all stories, all there to heal, to connect, to find the hope that had been lost. And there, at the center of it all, was Henry, 13 now, tall and confident, his grandmother's eyes shining with purpose. He was speaking to a group of older adults, listening to their stories, offering them comfort, and I felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought me to my knees. He had become the man I always knew he could be, and he had done it despite everything, despite his parents, despite the ugliness he had witnessed, despite the world telling him to look the other way. He had chosen love instead, and it had made all the difference. Sarah found me as the evening was winding down. She approached slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a wounded animal, and I saw the guilt in her eyes, the sadness, the weight of everything she had done and failed to do. She was thinner than I remembered, older, more fragile, as if the past few years had taken something vital from her. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but I held up my hand and stopped her. We talked for hours that night, really talked, the kind of conversation we should have had years ago, and she told me everything, her fears, her doubts, her regrets, and I listened without judgment. I told her about my own struggles, my own insecurities, my own failures as a father, and we found common ground in our shared humanity, in our mutual desire to do better, in our love for the same boy who had brought us back together. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, there was still pain, still distance, still work to be done, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. As I drove home that night, the stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The painful Thanksgiving dinner, the slap, the humiliation, the video, the years of silence and separation. It had been a long and difficult journey, but I had made it, and I was stronger for it. I had lost my daughter, found her again, and learned that love was resilient enough to survive almost anything. I had gained a grandson who was more than I could have ever hoped for, a young man who would carry on the values I held dear. And I had found a new purpose, a new community, a new way of being in the world. The scars were still there, they would always be there, but they were no longer open wounds, they were reminders of how far I had come and of the people who had helped me get there. The next morning, I received a text from Henry, a picture of the two of us taken at the community event, our arms around each other, our faces alight with joy. He had captioned it with a simple message: "Thank you for being my grandpa. I'm so lucky to have you." He looked at the picture for a long time, feeling the tears well up in my eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness, of gratitude, of love. He saved the picture to my phone, made it my wallpaper, and carried it with me everywhere I went because it was a reminder of everything that mattered, everything that was true, everything that was good in this broken beautiful world. Sarah and I continued to rebuild our relationship, slowly and carefully, like mending a broken vase. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old wounds reopened and we had to step back and heal, but we kept trying, kept talking, kept showing up for each other. The tension was still there, a ghost of the past that lingered in the corners, but it was no longer the dominant force in our relationship, and we were learning to love each other again, a gift I had never thought I would receive. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not revenge, not public vindication, but the quiet, steady work of forgiveness, the courage to open my heart again, and the love of a grandson who had shown me that even in the darkest moments, the truth, spoken by the smallest voice in the room, could heal the deepest wounds. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that remind us of what truly matters in life.